So please welcome the Executive Director of the Australian Institute, Mr. Richard Denniss.
Thank you very much. I told someone yesterday that I was off to give a motivational speech about the role of economics in driving change. Yeah, it actually got that kind of reaction. Let me start with a story. Last year, Australia dug up 400 million tonnes of coal. 400 million tonnes. Now, that's a big change, doubling our coal output, or we could change it in the exact opposite direction. We could actually reduce our coal exports. We could actually not build massive mines in coal mines in Queensland. Change is going to occur. What we have to struggle with in a democracy is what kind of change, in what direction. And even if we can agree on direction, what's the best way to get there? So when we think about change, we can't think about is it good or bad, because some things are going to change. We can fight to keep some things the same, but we won't be able to keep everything the same. So we have to have, if we want to think about change, we have to think not just about which kinds of change we want and which kinds we want to oppose, but how to drive the kind of changes we want to drive and how to prevent the kind of changes we want to prevent. And in turn, as individuals or as communities, we have to change ourselves in order to be effective drivers of the kind of change we want. Because in a democracy, just because you want to do it, who cares? It doesn't matter if you want to change the world in a particular way. You can change your world, I hope, but if you want to change our world, you have to work with other people. And a lot of what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is quite a large change in the way that communities try to drive change. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the changes that I've been involved in, some of the work the Australia Institute's done to help communities drive change. But in a democracy, it's not inevitable that when you set out to drive a change, you'll succeed. The group that is most able to get a large number of people to go along with them, the group that is most able to get a small group of people in Parliament to work with them, are the ones that are going to be the most effective. So I'll come back to that. Let me just introduce myself a little bit more. So I'm Richard Denniss from the Australia Institute, as you heard. It's a think tank based in Canberra. Most people don't really know what a think tank is, and we kind of like it that way. But really what it is, it's a research organisation. But as you heard in my intro, I'm an escapee from academia. I'm glad universities are there. I'm also glad I no longer work in one. But a think tank is a research organisation that is aimed at change. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do research for research's sake. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do research to win grants. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do research because we're intellectually curious. I'm glad people do that. But we do research to help drive change. We pick issues that we think that need change. We pick topics that are likely to attract attention towards the need for change. We try, bizarrely perhaps, to use economics sometimes, but research methods always, to attract attention to problems, to demonstrate the existence of solutions, in the hope that other people will either pay more attention to those problems, more attention to those solutions, and take them out into a broader community. Think tanks can't change the world, but we can put ammunition into the hands of other people. And that's what we set out to do. If you don't know anything about the Australian Institute, if you go to our website, all our research is there for free online. Sadly, academics are often forced to publish in journals that you have to pay thousands of dollars to access. One of the reasons I left. But also, there's a few familiar faces here. We run politics in the pub once a month. Perhaps it's the nighttime counterpart to an event like this. So there's a clipboard floating around. If you want to know about our events or our research, just put your name on that and we'll keep you posted. Okay, back to change. It seems a bit strange to think about economics as having a role to play in debates or conversations about change, but the science of economics is actually all about change. The purpose, economics defines itself. You sound like you're at University 101. You've got to know this. Economists teach each other that economics is the science, contestable that, the science of the efficient allocation of scarce resources. Right? Economists think they're in the business of helping people do change. We think we're in the business of helping people do good change. But of course, what kind of change do people think is good? What kind of change do people want? Well, that's where things get democratic and interesting, and where I think economics can either be a very powerful tool or a very destructive tool, depending on how it's used and who it's used by. The way that economics is used these days to stifle debate, or the way it's used to suggest there is no alternative. Want to tackle climate change? Yeah, who doesn't? But it will destroy the economy. You want to increase the incomes of the poorest people in Australia? Yeah, who doesn't? But it will destroy the budget. Anything you can think of that you want to do to make society a better place is likely to clash head on with someone spouting some version of economics, concerned with the budget deficit, concerned with competitiveness, concerned with unemployment, as an excuse, I would argue, for inaction. So if we want to have compelling stories, if we want to convince other people that not only is change desirable, which frankly is easy, but that change is possible, then I would argue that we need to have at least some capacity to counter the inevitable economic arguments that are used to suggest that tackling climate change, tackling poverty, spending more money on aid, doing anything about gender inequality, rather than just bump head on continuously into economic arguments, I actually think is a very important role for actually using or communicating stories, economic stories, that sell a positive case for change. So let me just start with a few of those. If you asked an economist back in the early 80s to project how many people would work in the mobile phone industry today, they would have predicted 0. If you'd asked an economist in the 1990s to project how many people would work in web design today, after they asked what web design was, they would have projected 0. Economists do not have a crystal ball. We have no analytical tools to help us anticipate likely technological or social change. None. 0. Yet, when someone comes to an economist and says, if we introduce a price on pollution, if we introduce a carbon price to help tackle climate change, what will that do to the economy? Well, if you've got a lazy $200,000 laying around, you could go and pay any number of economic consulting firms to generate a model that would suggest all tens of thousands of people will lose their jobs in the mining industry, or hundreds of thousands of people will lose their jobs in some other industry. Economists are very well paid, not at think tanks, but elsewhere, are very well paid to generate ridiculous projections of what the future might look like. And in turn, we can model why tax cuts for rich people will actually help poor people, why spending less on education will actually improve educational outcomes. You can do whatever you pay us to do. That is, of course, the danger of my profession. But, and this is a big but, the idea that introducing a carbon price will cause miners to lose their jobs, or the introduction of any policy measure designed to make the world a nicer place will harm some individual or industry. You hear these arguments all the time, but if we just look a little bit closely, we can break them down in a number of ways that hopefully help us to tell better stories about change. The first thing to know about change, as I said at the beginning, is it happens. It happens all the time. It's not caused by government, it's not prevented by government. Change is inevitable. In the last 20 years, there's been this evil, job-destroying technology that came along and destroyed tens of thousands of jobs, and not only tens of thousands of jobs, but thousands of small businesses around Australia. And you people here are probably partly responsible for this job destruction. Because the evil technology I'm talking about is called a digital camera. Does anyone remember Photo Development Labs? Remember them? There's still a couple around. They sell expensive photo frames. Photo Development Labs were once not only big, but growing rapidly, and the new technology came along, and now they're pretty much gone. There's a few sticking around, they won't be with us for long, and they certainly don't get most of their money developing photos. Go back further. Go back to the early 1900s in Australia, where 70% of Australians were employed in agriculture. So if you asked an economist back in 1900 to project forward, what will things look like in 2014? Well, an economist would describe most of us as unemployed farmers. Because today, 4% of people work in agriculture. And then, of course, coal and indeed petrol displaced another form of fuel. What was the form of fuel that petrol and coal were so good at replacing? Whale oil. So change, the kind of change we need to negotiate now, is not actually historically new. It's not even particularly interesting from an economic point of view, but from a political point of view, it's extremely, excruciatingly hard. Because a small number of people who make enormous amounts of money out of fossil fuels are very, very reluctant to change. And we want them to change. We need them to change. And just like the asbestos industry didn't want to change, just like the whaling industry didn't want to change, and Australia didn't stop commercial whaling until the 70s. Just like the whalers and the asbestos industry and everyone before them, the fossil fuel industry doesn't want to change. 2 years ago, the Australian Institute worked with a small community up in the town of Bulga in the Hunter Valley, where Rio Tinto wanted to build an enormous extend an enormous coal mine. And in order to create the political, economic and legal space to get this mine approved, they turned to economists, Rio Tinto did, and they came up with outrageous stories about how the mine had to go ahead to create jobs. Without the mine, there'd be no jobs. Indeed, Rio Tinto's economists argued that were the mine to go ahead, it would create, I kid you not, 44,000 jobs. Now, 44,000 jobs. The Hunter Valley has 500,000 people in it. And this one little extension of a big mine was going to create 44,000 jobs. Because the storytelling that the mining industry relies on is if we don't get our way, you will all suffer. If we don't get our coal mine and our enormous profits, you and your children won't have jobs. We'll be a third world country, we'll live in caves, we'll read by candlelight, you choose. Forget about the 400,000 tonnes of coal we dig up. Do you want to sign up for 600 or do you want to sign up for 200 or 0 or 800? So the small community, the Progress Association indeed, I didn't know they still existed to be honest, but I remember one from my childhood. But the Bulga Progress Association invited us to look at the economic claims made by Rio Tinto, and we went to court and we had a fight about economic stories. Their economic story was the mine would create 44,000 jobs. Our economic story was that it would create none. 0. One of us was going to be completely wrong. 44,000 versus 0. And we won. And the mine didn't go ahead. Because the mine had just made stuff up. When that small town, when that small community stood up to one of the world's largest companies and said, no, actually, we're going to call you out on this story. It doesn't hold true. We're going to tell a story about how your mine is going to destroy our community. We're going to tell a story about how your mine is going to cause air pollution and noise pollution and in fact make this town unlivable. That's the story we're going to tell. But we're not just going to leave your economic story alone so that people can choose between happy little community or we all become unemployed. The thing the people at Bulga did that was unique was actually thinking, no, we're going to have a crack at their story as well. And the thing is, their story just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And I'm really proud to say that last week, 2 more mines, one in the Hunter Valley and one out near Lithgow, were stopped on similar grounds. There was the community up near Singleton basically made the case in court. And again, it's a crime to lie to a judge. and you get paid a bonus for lying to journalists. So we've got to, it's significant that these court cases are being won because they're not allowed to lie when they go to court. The stories they tell have to be based on fact, whereas you can say anything you want to a journalist or a politician. So the community up near Singleton and the community out near Lithgow both succeeded in telling a positive story about the kind of community they wanted, but more importantly, they actually put some effort into debunking the story told by the mining industry. And that's a simple story that there is no alternative. That we're stuck on this path. Forget about the road of coal being 40,000 kilometres long. It needs to be 80,000 kilometres long. And if it's not 80,000 kilometres long, you'll all lose your jobs and live in poverty. That's the story that they tell, and it's rubbish. The economics behind it don't make sense. The court cases prove it. International experience shows that there's plenty of rich countries with no mining industry at all. How did some countries get rich without any mining industry? Yet how come in Australia we believe without a mining industry we'd all be broke? The mining industry is 83% foreign owned. I'm not xenophobic, but 83%, well, I'm not, but 83% of the dividend checks go offshore. How is that making us rich? It can't be making us rich, but it's a great story that they've told. So, the Australia Institute is, as I said, it's a very small organisation. It's a think tank based here in Canberra. We've only got a dozen staff, but you might have seen us in the media, or you might have come to some of our events. The thing we try to do, the thing where I think think tankery is different from other forms of storytelling, other forms of advocacy, other forms of change, is that we try to make sure that we can tell stories that are based on solid evidence, that are based on solid science, that are accessible to everybody. Because if you've got a great story, it's a fantastic plot, but you can't write, then no one's going to buy your book. So I do think that for people who want to drive change, you need to find a way to engage with other people. You need to not just bombard them with facts, but slot it into a story that not only persuades them, but a story that they can go off and tell other people about. So let me just end with one last story, one I hope you'll remember every morning and think about me. Trust me. Australia, as you may well know, is one of the world's largest emitters of fossil fuels on a per person basis. We're as bad as it gets because we use energy incredibly ineffectively. We're in 70% of Australian houses. It comes into your off-peak hot water system and it heats up half a tonne of water. Half a tonne of water warming up to 60 degrees just in case you need it. And then you step into the shower in the morning, you turn the hot on, you think, oh bugger, that's hot, and you add cold to it. That's right, people, there's no way to fix this. This is beyond the wit of man. Australian households spend 30% of their energy heating up half a tonne of water to a temperature that's just hot enough to burn your toddler and not hot enough to make a cup of tea. We've been doing it for 50 years. And no one's talking about changing it. So here we are, one of the richest people in the world has ever known, living in the richest country at the richest point in world history. We waste enormous amounts of energy. And every time that shower burns your leg, just think, maybe, just maybe, we could change things. Thank you very much.